Okay, cool. Hello everyone, very happy to be here. I won't have any slides, which is very unusual for me. So the only thing you will have is my voice and the mustache moving. It's quite hypnotizing. Don't just try to focus on the idea. But I should have done like Matt, because I've got, on my book, imagine something blue with an inverted mountain, and it says slow down or perish, the economics of degrowth. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about today, posing the basis for the discussion later by giving you a definition of degrowth and how it articulates with ecosocialism. I completely agree with what Matt said about the framing. It's not class war or degrowth. It's definitely class war and degrowth, in the same way that you have Batman and Robin, peanut butter and jam, class war and degrowth. So that'll be one of my points. But before we even get into that debate, we need to invest a couple of minutes to reflect on what is economic growth. And I swear this question is more interesting than it seems. Because when we speak of economic growth, we have this imaginary of somehow something desirable, of progress, of this civilizational elevator, of even productive forces. Economic growth represents our ability to transform things into useful goods and services. But that's not what economic growth is. Economic growth is a very more specific concept. It is the increase of gross domestic product, a very specific indicator that is rather blind because it's only a quantitative indicator of agitation. Imagine looking at an anthill from above, and all of a sudden you throw a rock into it and all the ants are moving. Well, this is what economic growth measures. You look at an economy from above, one part of that economy, mostly the market economy, or whatever you can put a price on, and then when there is agitation, then GDP goes up. But it doesn't tell you whether that agitation is desirable or not. And so here I thought I would bring a concept that I quite like. You guys all know, I suppose, the British anthropologist David Graeber and his concept of bullshit jobs, which he defined as, quote, a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obligated to pretend that this is not the case. End of quote. That's from David Graeber. I think there is something similar going on at the macroeconomic level, which is not surprising. If you put together a lot of bullshit jobs, what do you get? Bullshit growth. Definition: a form of economic activity that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that one cannot justify its existence without referring to abstract economic indicators to give it a false impression of necessity. When we're looking at high-income countries, where we have rates of GDP per capita completely decorrelated from indicators of well-being, I think in that situation, economic growth ceases to be something we should be striving for. Herman Daly, founding father of ecological economics, used to call it uneconomic growth, to say the past where further agitation generates more cost than benefits, and so where it's actually why are we just agitating ourselves for in the first place. And so that's my first point of just grounding, trying to just diffuse, unpack, dismantle, open up the concept of economic growth to really concretize what we're going to be talking about and realize that maybe a lot of the politics of the transition, especially climate politics, has been polluted by these economic abstractions, starting with that concept of economic growth. And that's often the challenge I give when I go and I debate mainstream economists, and I'm like, try to argue everything you just said, but you cannot use the word economic growth. And then they end up making some kind of degrowth sounding argument because they have to fall back on like concrete needs and they cannot use like monetary indicators. And I'm like, then we agree. End of the game. It actually works super well. You can try. And economic growth itself is a class war. That's something else too. I think the discourse of economic growth and its associated sub-ideology, trickle-down economics, the fact that somehow we cannot redistribute today, we cannot talk about the distribution of added value because right now we don't have sufficient growth, so we need somehow to kick-start the economy back through austerity politics, and then when we will have growth, then, you know, gold will just trickle and rain from the sky, and we will all be able to live in villas and castles and all of that. So the way I see it, in many countries, and France is one of them, and that was the addition of Thomas Piketty, when you look at the rate at which the class of the wealthiest people in society just get richer, and if that is just, you know, goes faster than the rate at which the bottom or the majority of the population enrich themselves, then economic growth become a driver of inequality. And that's what we've seen. So you can actually look at the gains from economic growth with this number from France. And from the 1980s to 2015, so the 1% of the population richest captured 21% of all gains of economic growth. So in that sense, we have this economic growth that is unsustainable. I think we don't have to come back to that basics, but because we've not been decoupling that growth from environmental pressures just simply because it's impossible. So we have this growth that is ecologically unsustainable. It's futile in the sense of it does not create goods and services that fulfill needs that were not unmet before. That's the bullshit growth aspect. But it's also a growth that does not solve the inequality gap we were having before. So it's what I like to call the false promise of growth. And this is, I'm opening on this because degrowth first and foremost is an objection to growth. That was the concept that comes from the 1970s. Not only a biophysical objection, we know the Meadows report and the birth of ecological economics, and people starting to worry that if we keep growing exponentially, at some point, infinite growth, finite planet, something has to go. But it's also a social objection to growth. On these two aspects, the fact that why would we agitate ourselves for things that take a lot of our time and energy, but that do not fulfill our needs? And even worse, if that not only does not fulfill our needs, but sustain a situation of exploitation where that specific organization that is supposedly most efficient to maximize GDP is relying on hierarchy, heteronomy, you know, hierarchical organization of production, and all of that. So that is the first point. And now I'm going to give you a definition of degrowth. And I've been thinking a lot about that definition. And I had it in French in the book. And I swear in French it's all poetical. You read it, it's like sweet little music. And I translated it in English and it sounds awful. But bear with me. It's not really about the choice of words. It's really about like the four features. So degrowth is a reduction of production and consumption. Yeah, pretty cool, eh? 15 years of economics, professional class type 3. So a reduction of production and consumption. So here we need to understand that degrowth is the opposite of economic growth at the macroeconomic level. There is no button in an economy to have growth or degrowth or to control production and consumption. It's just an emergent phenomenon, you could say, that derives out of power relation, incentives, institutions, and a lot of stuff. Right now, we're trying to do a lot of stuff within companies, within households, within commons, within governments to try to sell more, buy more, do all of that. And the result is we hope that at the end of the year, when we measure GDP, it is higher. If it is higher, it's economic growth. If it is lower, then there will be some form of degrowth. At this point, you know, that's the same as a recession. So let me add 4 elements in my definition. Degrowth is a reduction of production and consumption to lighten ecological footprints. So here, that is the key thing. It's just not a random shutting down of sectors left and right and center. It's just selection of ecologically intense goods and services in high consuming regions of the world in order to lighten an ecological footprint that cannot be sustained over the long term. So first and foremost, dislocate degrowth as a strategy for overly rich countries and especially for over-consuming classes within these countries. Planned democratically. So reduction of production and consumption to lighten ecological footprints, planned democratically. We'll see why that matters when I'm adding the third and the fourth. Planned democratically in a spirit of social justice and out of concern for well-being. So that those are my 4 points: sustainability, democracy, justice, well-being. And so first and foremost, degrowth is that macroeconomic diet, okay, for economies who collectively overshoot the carrying capacity of their ecosystems. Whatever you do, whatever you want, whatever politics you're on, like if you don't have this, you won't have sustainability. It's a fact. It is based on no forms of economic growth can be made sustainable on the long term. This is the most solid knowledge we have of what we've been observing in decoupling studies since the 1990s. It's also the most precocious hypothesis we can make about the coming decade. So I think whatever we want, we need this macroeconomic diet. But there's a difference between a diet and an amputation. And so we don't want a diet like an amputation like we've seen during the lockdown, where we just shut down random sectors and we just ask everyone to somehow tighten their belt without looking at exactly, the differences in income and wealth and footprints and all of that. And we don't want to do this in the way that is unplanned democratically, because then we cannot have the number 4th element, which is the concern for well-being. And I think here we completely agree, and that's one convergence between degrowth and ecosocialism. It's the abandonment of this hegemony of financial indicators to fall back on concrete needs. This is why some people call it also like a well-being economy. That's a concept that starts to rise. It doesn't have quite the bite that degrowth has, but it goes in similar direction. I think if we were to really apply that idea of a well-being economy, so an economy that agitates itself to respond to concrete needs, and therefore that stop to agitate itself when these needs are fulfilled, what we would see is basically today degrowth from a bloated capitalism that has created so many artificial needs that has got this mass bullshit growth. So we would see a transition to degrowth, and then we would see basically a steady state economy where levels of production oscillate based on needs. When you have needs of something, well, then you produce a bit more. When that need is fulfilled, then you stop. But no more exponential curves. And that's where I'm going to just do something conceptually quite cool, must I say. And that's what I do in the book. I'm like articulating that definition of degrowth, which we understand is a transition. Not going to do a diet forever. You do a diet until you've reached that point where basically your economy as an aggregated level has fallen back under sustainable planetary boundaries. But then you shift to another mindset. In the book, I call that mindset post-growth. So degrowth is the transition, post-growth is the destination. And of course, I offer a definition of that too, because I love definitions. And because, well, for a reason that we won't go in there, because this is not therapy, I made it symmetrical to the definition of degrowth. So remember degrowth, reduction of production of consumption, 4 elements: sustainability, democracy, justice, well-being. Post-growth is the same. So 1 element, a steady state economy. That's the descriptive part. Steady state economy in harmony with nature, where decisions are taken together and where wealth is equitably shared in order to prosper without growth. So you see here we have the same elements, the compass with the 4 values, but they take a bit of a different form. It's not a matter of lightening footprint, that's really a transitional quest. It's a matter of remaining in harmony with nature, which is a broader, more philosophical goal. Same thing, it's not just only a matter of just doing things in a spirit of social justice, so making sure that somehow the most vulnerable do not suffer from that transition. An example, for example, in the scenario I'm doing now for degrowth in France, we're organizing aggregated degrowth of the economy, roughly 50% by 2050 of GDP, without reducing the income of the half of the population with the lowest income. So that's our threshold. Whenever on the model, if we do anything and then somehow people within the poorest 50% get poor, then that's a red light. Like there's a problem. So that's why the spirit of social justice, but over the very long term, the question evolves into, well, we need to think about the distribution of wealth, not only the redistribution, but also the distribution and also the pre-distribution of wealth. So all these 3 big categories. And to do all of that in order to prosper without growth. I think this is, after all, the most fundamental sentence here on 2 grounds. First, if we admit biophysically that infinite economic growth is impossible, then we must build an economy that can function, and not only function, but prosper without that impossible goal. And if we are even a bit more pragmatic, and when I go and debate with my mainstream economist friend, I mean, they study what they call the secular stagnation, which is the observation that in all high-income economies, rates of economic growth are slowing down. They don't know why. They call it a mystery. Well, we can come back on that, but they call many things a mystery. But I think even from a mainstream perspective, if, for example, your public budget is heavily tied to GDP in general, and you see your GDP rates faltering year after year, you might want to reorganize the financing of your public budget and your public services. So that's just one example here. And now, so we have this double definition, and that's where I'm going to just comment a bit on what Matt said. I've heard politics of less. You know I don't like that term. And so I'm going to do a bit of math here. So I've heard politics of less from Matt, but then it was also, I've heard less is more from Jason Hickel. And so logically, that turns into politics of more. If we connect the two together, I mean, not a math expert, but that seems pretty legit. And my main point here is that the way the degrowth literature has been evolving, so the core hypothesis behind this is that that notion of sacrifice is very much tied to an economic imaginary where purchasing power is supposedly always good. But, I mean, if you want to increase your purchasing power in Paris to have access to housing, yeah, you can do that. If you have a low wage, you won't be able to do it. Or we can collectively organize to decommodify access to housing in a Vienna not-for-profit or in a public social housing way to make sure that actually we control prices of housing so, it's accessible for everyone. In that sense, if you were to divide the prices of housing in Paris through a collective organization of decommodified access, you could divide your housing expenditure by half without losing any living power. And so for me, I think here that's how we're squaring the circle in the degrowth scenario. We're like, okay, we want to reduce agitation, but we can do this in also improving access if we share more. And then I think that's the big convergence. Is that a production or a consumption problem? Both. That's why in every definition of degrowth, you always see this annoying repetition of like production and consumption. And have you ever noticed that they always come in that order? Never everyone said like it's a reduction of consumption and production. And I think that goes, and the point Matt makes is extremely important. And it shows that production today is where the power lies. Because again, if you're living in Paris, you cannot have the choice between either social housing at controlled prices or just, fast and furious, wild west world capitalism. No, you don't have a choice. And so we need to start by reframing production, and then we can open up different lifestyles, possibilities. And of course, it's a dialectical interaction. So some more people like already doing that in a way, and so we can inspire, like look at what they've been doing, for example, in Vienna, and trying to push for that in other places. So the goal from what I see it is, I'm an ecological economist, so I spend most of my life hunting for what we call rebound effects. Rebound effects are like STDs when it comes to just climate mitigation. Terrible analogies, remove this from the recording. What I mean is like you're changing something and you're trying to reduce someone's emissions somewhere, and when you do so, the emissions move somewhere else. So let's say everyone here, we decide to stop flying for some reason, or we decide to move all our savings to a bank that does not invest in extractive industries. We're going to do that, but let's say the airlines, for-profit airlines, they're going to be, oh my God, people are buying less tickets, so let's do some big sales. They're going to do some sales, and then people are going to fly that were not flying before because they didn't have enough money. And maybe more people than us deciding not to fly will decide to fly. And so all the emission we saved in that room will rebound. It can rebound because of consumption decisions. It can rebound because of production decision. In one factory decide, you know what, we're going to invest in changing all machines and get into more efficient stuff. They do it. But then another company is going to buy the old machines and use it. And that company before was not doing it because those machines were too expensive. But now all of the companies get rid of the polluting materials. And so that opens up some like low-cost, dirty production. Whatever we organize, we want virtuous cycle of reducing production that leads to reducing consumption, that leads to reducing production. We need tools that allow us to, every time we manage to save some emissions, but that works for all kinds of environmental impact, they are not spent elsewhere. And that works also internationally, which is very difficult, because we could say, oh, like in France, we stop using SUVs. Great, and then we keep producing SUVs and exporting them. We haven't solved the problem here. So like a ban of SUVs, together working and bouncing with activists that have been just raising awareness about the unsustainability of SUVs, working together with active mobilities and the building of safe bike lanes to provide an alternative to car-based transport. You connect all of those together and then you get, I think, a workable transition. I've got 7 minutes left. So I'm going to have to cut on a few jokes, I apologize. Because there's a text I brought for you guys, and this text has been published in April 2022. And that's the text that has coined the concept of ecosocialist degrowth. It's the text that has been written by Michael Lowy and Sabrina Fernandez on the ecosocialist side, together with Bengi Agbulut and Yorgos Kallis on the degrowth side. And they wrote a text together to agree on 8 points of convergence between ecosocialism and degrowth. And I think this is historical because there's been long-time debates since degrowth exists, so since 2002, between ecosocialists, between Marxists in general, and between degrowthers. So I think this text is important and is a good way for us to frame the debate, and I'm curious to see whether we will all agree to these 8 points, which I'm quickly going to go through. Number 1, capitalism cannot exist without growth. Pretty easy, I think we agree on that, and so that means capitalism must go. No, I'm doing quickly, and we'll go back to this in the discussion. Number 2, ensuring equitable well-being for all does not require economic growth. That was my point about bullshit growth, and that was Matt's point about decommodified access. If we change the structure of the system, including ownership of means of reproduction and production, then we can secure well-being for all without a need of further accumulation. Number 3, a significant degrowth in production and consumption is ecologically indispensable. So that's connected to limits to the impossibility of green growth. So degrowth is necessary. Number 4, productivist socialism, as practiced by the USSR, is a dead end. All forms of growth-based productivism are a dead end because we cannot decouple growth from environmental pressures. So it doesn't matter whether it's just green capitalism or luxury communism. It's just a biophysical impossibility. If you want to challenge that claim, I hope you have numbers. Come to me. Number 5, the rich countries must take the larger part in the process of degrowth. Then I think that claim needs to a lot of details, and I see Matt scribbling a lot of stuff, and then I can imagine what's being on paper is like, yeah, it's not a rich country, it's a matter of classes, they are just over-consuming really rich capitalists in the global south, and he's right. So we can go a bit deeper and like where exactly we locate that degrowth. And I agree that this class-based vision right now in a world where actually emissions are much more anchored to individuals than they are to countries. Just one number that Matt is going to like very much, from a Greenpeace Oxfam report in February 2022, where they calculated not the lifestyle footprint of the 63 French billionaire, but the footprint of their financial wealth. And they found out that the footprint of the financial wealth of these 63 French billionaires was the same in absolute ton that the footprint of 50% of the financial wealth of half of the French population. So when you look at their consumption footprint, it's pretty small. They're individuals. You know what are they going to do? They have a few mega yachts, a private jet. They're not going to eat 5 cows per hour. But when you look at the footprint of like what they do in their work, where they invest their money and where the passive money they have accumulated work, then you see enormous emissions. So that's also where degrowth must start. And I mean, one of the golden policy for degrowth historically has been just a capping on wealth. So that's also something that acts on that. Where was I? 6. So 6 is a very long statement, but basically it says that ecosocialist degrowth calls for a new mode of living. So they call it a civilizational transformation. French mouth, difficult. And so it comes with a set of values that mention solidarity, democracy, equal liberty, respect for Earth. So a break from productivism and consumerism in favor of shorter working time. So here it's also, I think, to remind us that there's a societal project. It's not only an adaptation to save the Earth, it's also a striving for a society with higher levels of well-being somehow. A fairer, more just, more respectful, less violent society, less hierarchical society. Number 7, and you guys are going to like this one. Quote, eco-socialist degrowth can only win through a confrontation with the fossil oligarchy and the ruling classes who control political and economic power. I think this sentence alone, justified the modification of this or to turn it into, it's not here maybe, into an and. So we see here, that's one point of convergence we agree on. And number 8, eco-socialist degrowth is part of a broader family of radical anti-systemic and ecological movements. So that's what they call the pluriverse. They mention Buen Vivir, they mention the Indian eco-swaraj, they mention, what do they mention? I don't even remember what they mention. But they mention a bunch of other imaginaries, cosmologies, societal projects in many different places of the world that have in common this resistance to growth-based neoliberal capitalism, to productivism and extractivism and commercialism and consumerism, and all this them together, which we summarize in the degrowth literature as the ideology of growth or growthism. We'll discuss whether that is a relevant analytical category. Okay, 1 minute to wrap up, because I know I'm over time. So that's one thing I've been reflecting on. So publishing a book and I swear I'm not going to show off, I was the first one surprised when my book became bestseller in France and was reprinted like 4 times in the month it was published. Because, I mean, it's a nerdy book on the economics of degrowth. And I did not try to make it like cooler than it was. It's just represent what degrowth is right now. But somehow, that captured the political imaginary. A lot of people were curious about it. A lot of people from various backgrounds. A lot of people from the professional class, of course, but not only. There's been like a lot of diversity in these events, and so I was reflecting on why degrowth is. How can we explain the fact that degrowth is so fucking cool today? It's strange, and I don't think I would have gotten there writing a book, but like, you know, deaccumulation of capital. And so I'm having this debate with friend Marxists that are like, oh, your approach is not powerful enough and people will never go for it. But the fact is that people are going for it. I mean, it's exploding. Degrowth books become bestsellers. You have people, Jason Hickel, I mean, that was an example. This guy's got 220,000 followers on Twitter, you know, and has become this kind of like mass communicant of that idea. So there is something here that we can use, I think, because as I hope I've managed to convey, degrowth build on an older Marxist criticism of capitalism and try to somehow, you know, add some stuff to it, but it retains, I think, the power of it. But it revamp it in a new, maybe cooler way that is more fitting to the context, because right now no one speaks about capitalism. You open the TV, you listen to your government, no one is talking about, oh, rates of the accumulation of capital are good this month, we're very happy, look at this capital figures. You know, no, they're like growth, GDP, GDP. So you tell them about degrowth and all of a sudden the class war begins. That's like, degrowth is in itself, you know, a war word, and we need them together, because I agree with you, so far we've not quite managed to create that moment of societal disruption. So I'm going to end on that note, and I'm very much looking forward to discuss more.